Hi, Professor. This is Vanessa presenting for MIS 4460 on vehicular crashes in New York City. This is based off of a data set I found on data.gov. It was New York City car crashes for quite a few years, and it's over 100,000 rows. So this is the original data set, which you will find in the zip file included in my submission. And so when I started, I really just looked through all the data, try to figure out how much was missing and what was helpful, what wasn't. And so I created a couple of extra columns here just to help with my analysis and to make the process of graphs and creating pivot tables a little bit smoother. And so starting with this crash date, all the way over, you'll find formulas and just the extra work I did in order to help create some graphs. My graph sheet is quite compiled here. And so I really just created a lot of pivot tables, created a heat map, just try to include as many combinations of the data as possible just to really get a good idea of different factors and variables and the way that they contribute to collisions in New York City. So with that, we'll go ahead and look at some of the graphs in more detail. And so here we can see the yearly collision trend. I was actually quite surprised by this as it seems that collisions have actually decreased, specifically from 2019 to 2020, but even after 2020, it stayed relatively lower than it had been previously, which does make sense as 2020 was the year of COVID, so people weren't quite driving, they were staying home, they were mandated to stay home. So especially in New York City, they weren't really driving around. But it was surprising to see that the data shows that even after COVID, the number stayed relatively low. I did a collisions per quarter within each year. And again, within 2020, you can see that quarter 2, which is really when it was the major lockdowns and mandated quarantines. In 2020 was one of the lowest points in the data. And there's some outliers on the end here where there's just some incomplete data that wasn't fully filled out. So yeah, that is the yearly collision trend. And then looking at the monthly and weekly collision trends, I fully expected the months to have the most collisions to be the winter months. And from the data, we can see that it was surprisingly the summer months where the collision trends were the highest. And it was the highest amount of just collisions in New York City. And then when we look at the crashes by time of day for the weekend versus weekday, we can see that most crashes actually happen in the middle of the day rather than in early morning or late at night, or even during rush hour traffics. And so it's interesting that you can see here at the bottom of the weekend trend, there's actually an increase at the night crashes. So there is a little bit of fluctuation there, which is a little surprising. Um, but when we look at our weekly trends, the um, highest day for crashes is Friday, with just a little over 100,000 crashes, but they all relatively are the same. So you can see that from the pie chart that the percentage of total collisions is pretty much the same for every single day. And there's not much variation there, but it is interesting to see the small number differences in each day. When we look at the different vehicle types and their contributions to collisions, the 5 highest collision contributing vehicles, the first one was a sedan, followed by a station wagon and sports utility vehicle, with the 2 highest collision contribution counts, the next three were relatively low and minuscule in comparison to those two numbers. But it was followed by a taxi, pickup truck, and then a box truck. And then the total injured persons per vehicle type, the types of vehicle stay the same in terms of ranking, and same with total killed persons per vehicle type. And so the data is pretty consistent in which vehicles are the most dangerous, really, in New York City for collisions. But you can just see that sedan and station wagon slash sport utility vehicle really contribute to most crashes that are occurring. Here we can look at the collision reasons and why most of these cars are crashing. And the biggest reason is driver inattention slash distraction. So that includes texting and driving, eating, drinking, looking anywhere but the road. Just really anything that's taking the driver's focus off of the road. That's the highest reason, followed by an unspecified. So these are most likely the reasons for being hit, or a car just not knowing what happened. But that is our second column. And then following too closely, so tailgating, failure to yield right of way, and then passing or lane usage improper. So just making poor decisions while driving. And these are the top 5 collision reasons, but then when we look at the boroughs that collisions happened in and the reasons for it, we can see that the lowest amount of collisions actually happens in Staten Island, with only about 19,000 collisions. And then the borough with the most amount of collisions was Brooklyn, with relatively high numbers of almost 200,000. And by looking at this map, the highest numbers are in red or gravitate towards red, while the lower numbers gravitate towards green, which means good, as there's not as many crashes. Yeah, so those are our collision reasons. For severity of day of the week, the injuries per day of the week is actually the highest on a Friday. So a person is most likely to be injured on Friday based on the data and these crashes. And on Sunday, it's the lowest amount of injuries that happened. And then for deaths, the lowest amount of deaths that occurred were on a Wednesday, while the highest was on Saturday. So that's a very interesting comparison of injuries versus deaths, as Friday was the highest number for injuries, but Saturday was actually the highest for deaths and was relatively low for injuries. So that just shows that the type of crash is more severe depending on the day, but there might be more injuries on another type of day. And so I hope you enjoyed seeing this analysis and that it was informing. I hope you have a great day. Bye.